Why is the leading cause of death for young black males between the ages of 15 and 34 homicide? For young males between the ages of 15 and 34 from all races, only one race has homicide listed as its number one and leading cause of death. That is young black males. I'd like to think about why that might be. We can speculate that it's because of poverty, and I think I've kind of thoroughly debunked that idea. I mean, I think that poverty does play a role in this, but I think there's some more underlying causes because, as I've said before, in the past, uh, blacks have been poor, leading going back to right after slavery, and the homicide rates between black males were nowhere near what they are today. So there's got to be some other causes. A lot of people will say that it's drug related, and I'm sure that a lot of it is, but there are lots of cases of homicides that have little to do with drugs and a lot to do with other things. I think what we have is a culture where violence is and has become normalized. It's become okay. We have uh, violence in movies, violence in music, violence. When I was going to school, I saw violence pretty regularly in the halls of my high school. People getting into fights, whole neighborhoods fighting one another. And I guess then they labeled it as gang violence. Uh, I didn't see it as such because we didn't in North Carolina where I grew up. We didn't really have at the time gangs. We had groups. We had neighborhoods. People hung out with their neighborhoods, and if one person from one neighborhood had a problem with another person from another neighborhood, then they would fight, and then it hit the news, and they label it as gang violence, but it really wasn't gang violence. It was just neighborhood violence. I don't think that you should label that as gang violence. I don't think it's the same. But one of the issues that I think about a lot of times when talking about culture and what leads to violence is parenting and how many folks actually parent their children and what kinds of things they teach their kids. I know that in the 80s and 90s, in the black community, we had a huge issue with teenage pregnancies. A lot of the people who had children and those children grew up to be teenagers got involved in violence. That could be a part of the cause there. Because if you think about how teenagers think, any race, teenagers are more likely to be involved in deviant behavior. This is something, sociologists, they look at these things all the time, deviant behavior in young males. And the teenage years are where you're most likely to see boys engaging in violent play or violent fights. They get into fights. I got into fights with my friends when I was a teenager. You see just a lot more of this kind of behavior during those teen years. Well, you think about that, and you put that with the fact that you have teenagers raising babies, and the mind of an infant, the mind of a baby, is like a sponge. The core of what a child learns comes between the day it's born and the age of 5 years old. That's when that child will get its foundation in terms of morals and who that person is, who that person becomes, those foundational pieces of information come when that child is between their birth date and 5 years old. I say that those are the most important years of a child in terms of learning, moral behavior and just learning how to treat others. So if you have a child who's been born to a teenage mom, a teenage father, then you have this element of violence and deviance teaching a child, its values. So that's one issue that I think we can point towards. Another thing I think we can look at is, and this is probably the biggest one for me, is single parent homes and single parent communities, especially fatherless communities. Male children especially look for role models or someone to teach them how to become male, or men rather. Children look towards the males in the community, and if those men or males are still teenagers, and these young children are growing up looking up to teenagers who are engaging in deviant behavior, more likely these teenagers in the community are still there with their moms. So then you have babies looking at, their oldest role models are teenagers. There's not a lot of older men in these communities for whatever reason. And part of that is because politics. If you look at a lot of the poor communities, if you have government housing, if men are in the house, then the women forfeit those benefits to actually live there. So if you live in a for example, a project, an inner city project, well, the men are not supposed to live in those houses with the women. Not if they're the father of the child. All those benefits go away. So this is just a cyclical type of program that has really put a big dent in the family structure in black communities. And I place a lot of blame for the violence and the poverty that goes on in black communities on policy. And make no mistake, these are policies that black people are voting for. So I don't know that we can be that angry if we are actually voting for those things. But I don't think a lot of people will admit that these are where the problems are coming from. I think people would like to think that the problems are coming from racism or some or has these problems have a history in slavery. A lot of people have argued, and I still see this argued now, that slavery is the reason why the black family is the way it is today. And I tend to disagree, because you can look years, multiple decades after slavery, and there was still a fairly intact family in black communities. It wasn't until the 60s that things began to get out of hand, and now we have like a 73% out of wedlock childbirth rate, and in some communities it's like 90% out of wedlock childbirth rate. So I mean, it's really high in those communities. They have a lot of problems with violence. So there seems to be a correlation with violence and folks not being in communities that have many fathers. People bring up poverty, so I want to touch on poverty just a bit. Poverty is, for the most part in black communities, a symptom of these single parent homes. For if you look at the dual parent homes, the parent homes with both the mother and the father, they have like a single digit rate of poverty. They're very low. And if for people who want to know how to stay out of poverty, there are 3 rules that you can follow to stay out of poverty. And most people who follow these rules, I think there's like a 2% rate of poverty for people who follow these rules. So it's a very low chance of living in poverty if you follow these rules. Those rules are: 1, graduate high school; 2, don't have children until you're over 21 and married; and 3, have a full-time job. If you could do those 3 things, you're more likely than not to be living out of poverty. And I say this in every video, but it's something that's important to me. So let's look back at the problem with young black males. Again, I've said that young black males between the ages of 15 and 34 have homicide listed as their leading cause of death. Well, another thing is that young black males make up about 4% of the U.S. population. 4% of the U.S. population. Yet they make up about 50% of the homicide victims. 50%. That is a huge amount when you look at the numbers. And, I just don't think that people are discussing this enough. I think that we really need to consider the reasons behind this. We need to consider that it's not some of the things that people claim. How many people do you know who've been violently attacked by people who look just like them? How many people do you know who've been shot by people who look just like them? And you may know somebody who's been shot and you don't even know they've been shot. This is a funny thing for me is I used to work in a small office, and one day somebody brought up the fact that they had been shot, and about 4 other people in that office talked about times when they had been shot, including a woman. And I was floored because I didn't know that many people in my office had, been shot. And one of them, I think, still had a bullet enlarged, and I think it was their thigh or something like that. But people I went to high school with, a lot of folks got shot in high school. Some of them were killed. So to ask ourselves, and there's not a lot of people talking about the issue of violence. Not enough talk in my opinion, because if the rates are this high, if we have young males who are dying at such alarming rates, if we have again, the leading cause of death for young black males is homicide. If we have that, if we have young black males as 4% of the population, but 50% of the homicide victims, and nobody wants to talk about, we're not screaming about this, kicking and screaming, yelling and cursing and carrying on about this all the time. Nobody's in the streets on the news screaming about this. Now, the issue that we are kicking and screaming about, and probably rightfully so in some instances, not in others, but if people are being shot by police. Now, I don't know anyone who's been shot, or I do know somebody who has been manhandled by the police. He got brushed up by the police officer. He actually videotaped it, so I saw the tape, and he was giving him a bit of a hard time. And that's probably another video I want to do, is how to deal with the police officers. I think people should, knowing what we know, I think that people should learn to respond to the police in a certain manner that won't get them killed. If we really care about people, we won't teach them to be, disobedient. When we learn that disobedience may get you shot, I think that's a foolish way to go about teaching people. But I'm just comparing these two things, and we have, all these deaths that are occurring at the hands of other young black males, and there's not nearly as much discussion about it. I think there needs to be more. I think we need to consider the reasons behind all this stuff. And of course, I think we ought to consider culture. Anyway, that's my time. I'm Chi Brown. Subscribe, like, comment, and I'll see you next time.